Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the pleasure of talking to poet Jeremy Schraffenberger, also JD Schraffenberger, author of American Sad. Before I introduce you to Jeremy, I'd like to invite you to become a subscriber of the Poet to Poet newsletter on Substack if you aren't already. Just go to poettopoet.substack.com and subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So again, today I am thrilled to introduce you to Jeremy Schraffenberger. He is the editor of the North American Review and professor of English at University of Northern Iowa. He's the author of two books of poems, St. Joe's Passion and The Waxen Poor. His other work has appeared widely in magazines and anthologies, including Best of Brevity, Best Creative Nonfiction, Notre Dame Review, Poetry East, Prairie Schooner, and elsewhere. So, Jeremy, welcome to Poet.
Thank you so much, Radha. It's an honor to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. And I also just want to say what a gift this series is, what the gift that Poet to Poet is, because it's for people who often don't have community. We're writers. We're often introverts. Our very job description requires us to spend time alone inside of our own heads for a long period of time. And so it's nice to actually talk with other people about what we're doing and share. So thank you for creating this community.
My pleasure. And I'm really excited to talk about your new chapbook, American Sad. And because it's a chapbook, I'd like to start with this question that I get a lot from students. And that question is, should I try to publish a chapbook first, or should I just go for a full-length book? So you've done both. And aside from the difference in length, how do you think about these choices in publishing?
Yeah, well, I think if you have a coherent collection of poems that is chapbook length, that's great. That is a legitimate form. We should honor the chapbook form as a thing unto itself. That it's not lesser than a full collection of books, it's a full collection of poems. It's just a smaller bit of it. In fact, I would argue that it makes that work even more precious. That you have less of it. It doesn't mean that it's lesser. It just means there are fewer poems, fewer pages. I think when Frank Bedart was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for the chapbook, and when was it, 10 or 12 years ago, that sort of legitimized the chapbook. Suddenly we could say, oh, okay, I too could be nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. I too could be a finalist and get that legitimacy. For me, the difference in the chapbook in terms of, besides just length, that's just the formal constraint of number of pages, but for me, it really came down to the intensity of the poems themselves. I didn't think could be sustained for much longer than the pages in a chapbook. So in other words, these poems are, I think, at least, they're strange, somewhat nightmarish. In fact, I used to call them to myself nightmare poems. And I thought if we put it on the cover of the book, it might dissuade people from buying it. But I don't think that you can spend much time in nightmare or in really intense memories, speculations, images. And so I felt like that was appropriate. Like I wanted somebody to be able to visit this consciousness for a bit and then be able to set it down. Whereas the other collections that I put together were much more of a project book. I think that project books are so common nowadays, we even forget that it's a genre. And I'm happy to talk about these older books that I published, but they had also narrative involved. And so I had to honor story as well as lyric. I had to honor something that could be filling in gaps of a drama that's taking place, rather than hitting another intense moment of surrealism or something deeply lyrical. So there are different imperatives too. That's one of the reasons I was kind of compelled to keep going in the other books, and I was compelled to stop with this new chapbook. Yeah, I'm wondering what the actual difference might be between chapbooks, full collections, and if you throw in this idea of project books as well. Because in some ways, this book is a project book too. It's just a project book in technique and process, rather than a project book in terms of theme or narrative or topic.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. What's the thing that's going to drive the work to cohere?
Yeah.
Right. Is it going to be a narrative? Is it going to be, a more of a technical aspect,
Yeah.
a craft aspect, a form aspect?
Yeah. And non-project books, you think about this as like, oh, the poems cohere because it's the same poet, the same voice, the same aesthetic. You sort of like you're spending more time with the same person almost. And that's fine. That's great. I would venture to say most books are like that, where you don't have this other frame or structure around it. But I think that's slightly different from what I've done in this book, which was try to I had certain process and certain way that I composed. I didn't have There are some technical things or some formal things you can see on the page that make these poems distinct and to make them cohere. But it's more than just my own personal writing voice, I think, that's holding it together. It was really like what I set out to do when I actually decided that I was going to write some poems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So tell me about where did the poems start, and when did you realize that you wanted to go in the direction that the work went?
So I was looking this up because I knew this would come up. Like, how long have you been working on this? So I started this in the spring and late spring, early summer of 2019. I started this project. I had no idea if it would be a full collection chapbook. I just knew that I had this instinct to write poems in a certain way. So my previous collections, I would say stylistically, formally, the poems were very wrought. I was very in control of every aspect. I was making decisions consciously and meticulously. One might say obsessively, and maybe unhealthily as a writer. You want to let go. You want to be able to go a little bit wild. And so I decided I wanted to tap into, or not tap into, I wanted to be out of control. I wanted to not make conscious decisions, but allow my unconscious mind to make decisions for me. So it was simply a matter of beginning to write and kind of following my consciousness rather than trying to express what I might have already had in my mind. It was really a matter of discovering what was there. One might say this is a collection of like me on the couch, like just kind of riffing or on a psychiatrist's couch, just kind of riffing what's coming to mind. And then, of course, the huge challenge is to take that raw material and to shape it without losing the trace of that process along the way. So despite these poems, and if I get to read one or two of them, you'll hear just, and if you see them on the page, you'll see that they do kind of jump around and they're kind of wild in some ways, or dreamlike or nightmarish at points. I still went back and obsessively revised, but I didn't want to revise out what I would normally have tried to get rid of in the past. So it was kind of a leap to do this. It really was. I'm somebody who likes to be in control. So for me, this felt like the most vulnerable thing to do is just to allow what comes up to be there and to acknowledge it, to honor it, really.
Yeah. I think the poet Matthew Zapruder talks about knowing that it's a poem when there's something on the page that he doesn't understand.
Yeah.
So it's that idea of just writing into the unconscious material. I love that this chapbook, is sort of a crystallized version of that process for you.
Yeah.
So tell me, or actually, let's hear a poem, because I think it's a good time for listeners to hear what we're talking about.
So I'll read a poem called "Time." It's from early in the collection, and it contains the phrase that gave the title to the chapbook itself. And I was going to also say that when you do have this kind of process of allowing what comes to come, of not controlling it, allowing it to emerge, and then honoring it for being there as part of yourself, as part of your psyche, and not revising it away because it's scary. Like if you allow yourself to do that, you do end up in sad places. You do end up in traumatic places and painful places. This book is called American Sad. I wasn't going to bury the lead, but I'm not a sad person. That's the thing. Like, this is not a reflection of who I am as a person in my life. This is, I think, a collection that contains, I think, probably an inherent human sadness. So I'll read this poem, Time, and you'll hear where the title comes from. Time. I haven't worn a watch in 10 years. You can't escape it anyway. Nobody tells you when you're young, pay attention to your body. All those years you could have had a different life. It's only habit to measure a day as duration. 1, 2, 3. My daughter's piano lessons teach her relativity. She bobs her head 4 times, counting whole notes. I think about her future life, the troubles, the pain. Who knows how many times she'll contemplate death? What kind of world could she possibly enjoy? Is it enough to carry a few pleasant memories of camping in the woods? You can endure almost anything for a few minutes, but there's a peculiar American sadness that lasts forever. If I had it to do over, I would. New everything. Start again every day the first. It might end happily in love. The body holds in its possession the passage of time, your heart, your breath, the final atomic fixture. On whose account do we draw? I have to believe she'll find a way. Nothing happens in 3 dimensions, I know, but the 4th one is such a sad story. It must be worth telling.
I was really drawn to that poem when I read the chapbook. So I'm really glad that you picked that one out to read, because I think it embodies a lot of what the whole book is doing. Sort of opening up these interior spaces. And like the description of the book includes the word haunted.
Mhm.
Haunted has that outside inside kind of feeling to it, right? Like that there's something in the environment that is sort of deeply chiming with a darkness in the human, in the body. And so I love how this poem brings those elements together: the scientific, the familial, right, the
Mhm.
parental, the worry, and all of it being embodied in consciousness as well as literally in the body. So how did you think about, so haunted is one way to describe these poems. How else might you describe them, and how did you think about the thematic quality of the work?
Well, first, I have to say, like, thank you for that interpretation of this work and your descriptions. I wish I would have asked you to blurb the book now. This is a really great way to think about it. Um, so the end of that poem, I think, kind of introduces in a way the one of the themes, which is to tell your sad story. So there's a sad story and it's so sad that it must be worth telling. And so going to these familiar scenes that exist in your memory or that exist in family lore throughout that just you can't get rid of. They constantly recur. And so sadness, grief, pain, all these things in these interior spaces are certainly, um, I think, thematically make the whole work cohere. And I often tell my students, like, nothing hugely dramatic happens in this book. I mean, there's some suicide, there's some attempted suicide as well, but it's I'm not revealing like some deep, dark, emotional trauma that I've experienced. I think I'm carrying the everyday, ordinary American sadness that I describe. Um, but so I tell students that what happens is always not always the point, that it's the relationship you have to the memory of what happened. It's not even a relationship to what happened. It's a relationship of the story you tell yourself about what happened that will reveal meaning, that will reveal the significance that ends up becoming universal. So I often think that we pose on as writers, we do pose on the page as everybody. We're performing ourselves all the time. And if you're too concerned about how you come off, how you are presenting yourself, you won't get to anything real or anything true. And so if you perform so that you are the, laudable heroic figure, what you're doing is showing how you are different from everyone else. Whereas really, I think what we do in art is try to find those moments that we share. And pain is one of those things. Like writing about happy stuff, great. I can like give you a thumbs up. Writing about how awesome you are, great. You're different from me because I think we can all identify with pain and suffering and sadness. So in a way, that's kind of why I feel like these poems were necessary, because it was a way to find community, not community in specific interest, but community in our humanity and the inevitability of pain. I'm kind of talking around some of that question, but I'm hoping that's getting at some of what you were asking about.
I think in a lot of these cases that we can only talk around it, the experience of what the book's about is in the poems, right? And, there's only so much that can be said about, a lot of it is unconscious, right? A lot of it, aside from maybe some of those formal choices, right? So we can talk about the project, we talk about the form, the stylistic differences, but it's really hard to talk. I mean, if it's good poetry, right? So thank you for it, at least humoring me with an answer. I think it was brilliant. So I want to talk a little bit more about this title, because I think it's really interesting. I think that, so sadness is something that poetry has been in relationship to for, as far as poetry goes back, right? So we have the Lamentations from the Mesopotamian traditions. So we know that poetry is very good at holding a space for emotions such as sadness. So maybe that seems like, okay, well, yeah, so a book about sadness, great,
So what? Yeah, right.
Well, no, I'm not thinking, so what? But American sad. I mean, Americans we add America to that equation, and suddenly it becomes a little bit, it's slightly counterculture, or slightly even, it's rebellious against.
I love that. Yeah, and I think about that phrase too, and what it is, what it suggests. Like, what is an American sadness? And you can put it into relationship with the American dream and the promise that is the lie of the American dream, and the idea that you can always get ahead, that you're always going to, or that you have the possibility of rising, not being in your station. But of course, there's so many things in place that keep us from achieving that carrot, right? And so it's the sadness that lasts forever, because you can't achieve some of the idealistic promises that are also systemically lies, or ways to keep people in check. It gets very political very quickly if you put it into conversation with that, or even like this the sort of American self-help ethos, prosperity gospel. Put it into conversation with that. And the American sadness, the sadness will last forever in that context, because those are impossibilities. Those are lies. Those are fictions, and they're attractive fictions. And maybe parts of them are true, but not the whole. You can't get there as a whole. And I can't help but also think, my God, I'm such a Whitman guy. I just love Walt Whitman so much. And when you were talking about this, about sadness, I thought about that poem "Oh Me, Oh Life" from late in Leaves of Grass. I think it's the Deathbed edition. It may have been written before then, I'm not sure. I was associated with the Deathbed edition though, and that word, which is the poetic word, the word "oh," just the single letter "oh," which stands for me for sadness too. And of course, that's an ancient word. It's an ancient gesture in poetry. It's not American, but what's the American "oh"? And I think of that poem. I have also this pet idea about lyric poetry in general. Maybe it's American, maybe it's not, maybe it's just lyric poetry, but that lyric poetry gains its energy from these two poles. One, the O of sadness and lamentation, of expression, of simply wailing, right? Of saying, I am sad, I feel, I am human, I have pain, I suffer. That's the O. And it's a beauty and terrible. It's an awful experience, but it's so important that we have it and we acknowledge it. And then the other pole of lyric poetry is the I, the capital letter I, the me, the self, the expression of my identity. And I like "Oh Me, Oh Life," the Whitman poem. That's the poem that ends, and you too shall contribute a verse, right? So it's an invitation that you are going to be part of the large project of poetry as well. But "Oh Me, Oh Life" contains those two poles in it. Oh, sadness. Oh, me. Oh, I. And Whitman's poetics are very much, I think, inform, this book, but probably not my other books. But but if you, one of the models, it's one of many models of poetry that he had, which is a model of respiration, where Whitman, you know this very well, breathes in the world, which he called sympathy. So you breathe in the world with sympathy, and you have to pay a certain kind of attention to the world to sympathize with it. And you bring it into yourself, and it becomes part of you. It is your body now. You've brought the world in through your eyes, through your senses. But that's only the first necessary but not sufficient part of creating art. The second part is to breathe out. So it's the respiratory model. You breathe it in and then you breathe it out. And he said that was pride. So you breathe out in pride. You express who you are. You state. You assert. And I feel like that's exactly what I'm trying to do. The little spaces that are created are almost little O's. And then, of course, the expression of the psyche is happening all throughout here. That's just a pet theory I have in mind. I hadn't anticipated talking about it with you today, but it feels apt when we're talking about sadness.
Yeah.
Do you
Well,
find that any of that resonate with your work as a writer?
oh yes. Yeah. Yeah. If I might, I just want to take a tiny tangent, because this I and O.
Yeah.
So I taught a class recently called Toward Mystery, and it was unpacking the ways in which poets make meaning without logic, without conventional logic. So how do we create meaning on the page without following conventional logic or narrative, right? So lyric and sound, right? The sound sense in poetry is way off the charts. And if you look at what scientists are saying about vowel sounds and the meaning that's conveyed, the feeling tone that's conveyed in vowel sounds, you have the I at the top, i.e., it's very bright. It's kind of up here. And you say it, you can feel it in the body, right? I, and it has that outward expressiveness. And the O is the bottom. The O is on the bottom of that scale, and O conveys those darker emotions, the sadness or the heaviness. And this isn't, prescriptive. It's not across the board, but we can feel it's like almost like a scale through the vowels, right? Between that low O, and I mean, think of how many words we have that express that kind of, lamentation or sadness. Oh, it's like all down here.
You have affirmed my whole life, Radha. This is great. I feel like you've proven me right somehow.
I mean, it's exciting when you find these threads, and for me, I am a bit of a science. I'm interested in science that is moving towards those mysteries, right?
And your book too. Is that your book on the shelf here over here behind you?
Bloodline. Yeah.
So that's science all over the place, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So I definitely come to it through family predilection, but I would just encourage you also to check out the work of Reuven Suhr, Tsur, who is he's written a book called what is it? I'm going to look at it across the room here. It's What Makes Sound Pattern Expressive.
Okay. And that study is in this book?
And he cites other researchers who are doing similar work, but I'll send you the geek links if you want them. But it is very exciting to feel that there is there are other possibilities, right? And in a world in which we are more and more moving towards our ethos is based in logic and kind of a narrow logic. Having a chapbook like American Sad, I feel, is this deep invitation back into a fuller experience of what it means to be human. More meaning is available to us than just through logic.
That's great. I appreciate you saying that, actually. Yes. And although when I read the poem aloud, listeners cannot see, nor can the viewers of YouTube see, that there's no punctuation at all, that some of the line breaks are, they have some meaning, but the left-hand side of the page is, all capitalized. And so it's challenging to read these on the page visually. And that was one of my nods toward not even ceding to grammar as a way to, or not grammar, but punctuation as a way to pattern or organize my thoughts. Just allow it to blend and blur, not as a way to sort of make the reader struggle, but as a way to really retain the trace of the process itself. Those were conscious choices to leave them in there, and of course, playing around where I feel like the ambiguity or obscurity is too much versus just right. I did play with that, but that's just yet another way in which I tried to honor that different way of being human.
Mhm. Yeah, right. It's uncontainable. The line's a little bit uncontainable.
Yeah, yeah.
The thought is a little bit uncontainable. The expression, the feeling, all of that. Yeah. Talk a little bit about the choice to capitalize at the beginning of the line, of every line.
Yeah, so it does seem a little passe nowadays to do that, right? It feels a little like a little old fashioned to do that. I noticed though, let's see, I was reading a lot of Robert Pinsky, and I noticed he was doing that a lot. I thought, okay, I enjoyed that part of it, or the way he was doing it. I was also reading a lot of Martha Solano. Now she doesn't do the capitalized letters, but she has a lot of. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She's a great poet of science. If you haven't had her on the program, you should. She'd be a great interview. But she's one of my favorite contemporary poets, and more so her syntax, which is very much serial syntax, parallelism, parataxis, rather than sort of subordinated clauses and so forth. And so I was really into her poems and how they had this feeling of prayer, of litany. And I remember I wrote a review of one of her books, and I remember describing it as like the old-fashioned typewriter carriage. When it gets to a certain spot, it goes ding, and you have the little lever and you push it all the way back to the left. Now I'm young enough not to have typed too many times on old-fashioned typewriters, but I'd still feel that. I still remember doing that on the tiny little toy typewriters we had. The feeling of the ding, and then you go back and you start afresh from the same spot. And I wanted to mark the page in a way so that here's the spot, it's capitalized because I dinged and I went back. It was also just one more way, just like I didn't want to have punctuation. It was like a rule that I gave myself that allowed me to retain that trace. So too, I just decided to let the capital letters be there, so I didn't have to make a decision one way or the other. I let that just be. It was one less thing I had to think about. And so in some ways, it's just like, all right, that's a rule. It's an arbitrary constraint. That's just going to be the way it looks. Now I can allow my mind to worry about other things. Because even if I was not capitalizing it, we have autocorrect, and sometimes you have to go back and actually correct it. That's distracting from my mind as I'm fixing what it looks like. Right. And it disrupts that trance that I was trying to get in while writing these poems. So it may seem like, oh, that's, you can fix that later. I said, no, I wanted to retain that because that was part of the way that I was in this mode, and the way I could be thinking in the way I was thinking and feeling in the way I was feeling. So yeah, it seems arbitrary and silly, but I think it's actually pretty vital about revealing how it is that I put these together.
Oh, I didn't think it was arbitrary, and I didn't feel it as a archaic kind of choice. I felt that it was a in my experience, it was like the counterweight, right, to this weightlessness at the end of the line. So there's an interesting kind of balance in that choice. I mean, I love this image of the typewriter. I actually started on a typewriter when I was, whatever, 6 years old. Yeah. And I mean, I can smell the ribbon, like
ribbon. Yes. And those little whiteouts that you would get, you have to, it has the little wheel, and you would put it on the page and you try to scroll back up to exactly where you're typing. Gosh. Yeah. Those moments are important. And I type on a computer now. Do you compose on a computer, or do you do longhand?
No, I've long ago let the typewriter's right here, actually, right there.
Oh, look at this.
Yeah, that's my little artifact. But yeah, so I'm like anyone, I write on my laptop these days. So but I love these sort of these choices that become sort of part of the landscape of this particular body of work. right? Like, I imagine in the poems that you've written since this work, or, maybe it's just imagining what you would write next, you might not be making the same choices, but that they're specific to this sort of time period and subject matter.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. Because I've begun writing a few new poems, and they're different, but I learned something from writing these poems that I've retained. So if my earlier work I feel was a little meticulous and a little controlled, and I stand by them. I enjoy them. That's part of who I am as a writer. And this was a sort of unfurling and stripping off well, stripping away any kinds of control mechanisms. My new poems, I feel like I'm able to tap a little bit into the wild and a little bit into the unconscious in a way, but keeping them a little bit under wraps or keeping them a little bit in control. So I have learned something from this, though they do look and feel different. It's really liberating, actually. I kind of feel like I don't know, this was a learning process. And I wrote a ton of poems that didn't end up in this collection because I think the first year of writing in this mode, I didn't use any of those poems because I was teaching myself how to do this. And then eventually I caught on, and then many of the poems I wrote after it did appear, and there were fewer of them that I felt like were, lemons, or they just wasn't going to places that I was interested in going, or that were fruitful in some way. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
Would you like to read another poem?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to read a poem called Piano. I'm going to scroll down and find it. So in that last poem I read, there's a scene where my daughter is practicing piano. And a few years ago, right just before I started writing these poems, I went to visit my family, and I was going to a funeral. I was visiting my family alone. I was driving our van, my family's van, and my parents had my grandfather's old piano, and he was someone who he taught himself to play. He was autodidact. He said he played by ear, and he would make the joke about playing by ear. He was also someone who played, he taught himself, and who only played the white keys. So I don't know how he did it, but he transposed everything into C major or A minor. I don't know, but he did. But I have vivid memories of him playing piano. He played many things from the Great American Songbook. But when I went back home to visit, I decided I was going to take that piano back with me it was about a 9-hour drive, and I did, brought it back. Never played the piano in my life. And I got a sabbatical and said, you know what, I'm going to learn to play piano. So I taught myself to play piano, and now I'm witnessing my daughter taking lessons, on the same piano, which is kind of nice to keep it in the family. So there's that image, and pianos appear, as you know, having seen the manuscript already, pianos appear throughout as images. And in this case, I don't think you need to know much of anything except that my grandfather was an alcoholic, and late in his life, he would hide his beers around the house because he wasn't supposed to be drinking, and he hid them often in the piano. So he would hide beers in the open up the piano and put them down in there, thinking that we wouldn't look. All right, so here it is, Piano. The garbage truck exhales up the rancid street. The smell stays for a visit on the hot morning porch. I'm sitting at the piano, watching shadows darken. Follow the black keys into the universe of vibration. My grandpa used to hide his cans of beer inside. You could crouch beneath while he played, his foot a circus animal, pouncing the brass pedal. I'm certain I've told you this story before. One day, long ago, a hulking beast sagged the back of my uncle's truck. 88 yellow keys, mild with predator menace. Do you know how it feels to hide what you love most? Dripping sweat onto the strings and felted hammers. This machine knows me, invites me to come inside. I slide the secret door open, squeeze behind the wires. I can't believe it's taken me this long to realize I belong here. I stroke the steel cranks and gears. One day, his wife died from a medley of cancers. One day, he blacked out in his car at a red light. Inside, I climbed down the fire escape ladder. We're poking for bottles and cans in the alley, grubbing for sidewalk change, looking for a friend. He plays sad songs like this one in C major. For some reason, he's singing for sentimental reasons. We're all of us born of peasant stock by now. All of us have learned to read and write. I remember him playing stride piano in the back of the truck. It feels true. I hope you do believe me. I'm there with him, laughing as it rumbles down the sunny street.
I'm just so blown away by this image of hiding the beers in the piano, which is, in a sense, this incredible metaphor for what we do typically with our sadness, which is to hide it, or we drink to keep it down. The piano is, it's an instrument of beauty. It's the voice that brings music into the world. And so here it's like the metaphor of poetry or the poet, right?
Exactly. And there was something about the piano too, is as opposed to like a guitar or a clarinet or a flute, the piano is bigger than you. The piano is and I call it a beast here. The piano is almost, you have to be it inside, like you're sitting at a thing at it. You're not controlling it. You can't just pick it up. So there's something intimidating about the piano too, as almost, creature-like. One other thing about my grandfather's piano, I didn't put it in this poem, although it's like, it feels even more resonant. That piano that I took home, that I got from my parents' house, because my parents didn't play piano, and I thought I would take it and learn myself. Well, that piano has little holes on the lid, 2 little holes right here, because he used to lock it because he didn't want the kids to play on it, because it annoyed him. Like, of course, it's annoying to hear little kids banging on the piano. So I never, as a child growing up, watching him play piano, I was never allowed to touch that thing. And so that, that's even more sad. That's an American sadness, Radha. That's really sad. But now that's the piano that the lock has been broken off, and I almost liberated almost that memory and that sadness by playing on that piano, learning to play, and now giving it to my daughter to learn, almost breaking that generational trauma.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to say, it's like generational healing versus passed down trauma.
Do you know the song For Sentimental Reasons? It's like an old Nat King Cole song.
I'm sure I do, but I can't remember it right now. But
so I read this poem not so long ago at a reading in South Dakota, and it just so happens I'm on a stage with a grand piano, a Steinway behind me. Like, when do I get to play on a Steinway? So I'm reading poems, and I read this poem, and I said, so if you want, I can play a little. And they're, yes. And I was like, who doesn't like to hear piano? So I was shocked that no one knows For Sentimental Reasons. And so I started playing and singing a little bit. I said, come on, guys, you know the song, and no one was singing along. So it was a little funny, but it also gave a little flair to the reading. I'm sure people will remember that.
That's great. Boy, that's like next level for readings.
Yeah, right.
I'm not to like get my my violin out or something for my
yeah, right. Or write a whole bunch of poems that are multi art, and you can go and demonstrate them on stage.
So I'd love to know what, it's a little bit different outside of the work. So what or who supported you most in doing this work? And did you, for example, did you work with or do you work with mentors? Do you have peers? How does that look for you?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are in the same boat. You have writer friends that you develop over years, going to graduate school, perhaps, or just a writing group. For me, in my case, I met my wife in grad school, doing a PhD at Binghamton University, and she's a novelist, but she's written poetry before too. So she's always my first reader, and during this, also the process of writing these poems, we go with a friend to a cabin in Virginia every year, and it's our writers retreat. So we spend a week there, and so a lot of these poems were written in the context of that writers retreat, where all of us have different writing projects, and we would work on it in the morning, afternoon, up to cocktail time around 5 p.m. We would come together, have a drink, and share something that we've written. So that kind of community, I mean, I'm very blessed and privileged to have that opportunity to do that kind of thing. But it does help you to know that you're not writing in a vacuum and people are there for you. However, I also want to say for those who are writing poems and wondering what to do with them, because I think that's probably, one of the questions at the heart of what you're doing with Poet to Poet. What do I do now with these poems?
Yeah.
For years, I had no um, designs for these poems. I didn't send them out. I really was not submitting them. I wasn't sharing them. I wasn't, except for my wife and other writer friends at this retreat. It was really just. It wasn't therapy, and I knew I was creating art. It wasn't bibliotherapy, but I wasn't taking the next step to submit them. And I wasn't scared. It's not. I mean, like I get rejected all the time. That's like I'm fine. I feel like getting rejected is just like paying your taxes. You need to do it just to know that it's part of the whole deal of being alive and being an artist. You're going to get rejected. So I wasn't doing anything with them. And then I did start to submit some, and then some of them were published, and it sort of like snowballed from there. And then when I started thinking I would put together a chapbook manuscript, I knew that I was going to send it to Main Street Rag Press, which was who published the first batch of poems that I submitted. And so I felt like, all right, I know the editor had some reaction to these poems, like thought these were worthy to share in the magazine. And so with his press as well, and he was happy to accept the whole manuscript. So yeah, that was a little bit of the process of what I did with these. I didn't think that I didn't know what to do. I was just living with them. They were just like little places I would visit, and then eventually I started taking them more seriously as something to share with the larger reading community.
Yeah, I that's an interesting strategy to think about that. That the group of poems that got accepted, and then to follow through with that chapbook.
Yeah.
I think not every journal is going to have a chapbook or
Right.
full length collection publishing arm of their work, but sometimes that is the case, and why not sort of use that you've already gotten your foot in the door. I mean, I think this happens a lot on the nonfiction side where a writer will write an article and it goes viral, and then that article then turns into their next book. So I love that. Poets can be we can be strategic.
Well, and I'll also say, and this is for people who are publishing writers, they're thinking about publishing a chapbook or a full collection for that matter. I'm editor of North American Review, as you said, and like I've fielded questions before about what, like, somebody's looking for a full length publication. Would I have any advice? And I've given plenty of advice, because these are like poets, especially I publish. I would say, we love your work. We published it. It's in our pages. Don't be afraid as a writer to reach out to editors who've published you, even if they don't have a publishing arm where you're going to get a chapbook or a full length, to say, hey, do you have any advice? And sometimes that person will say, you know what, I do know an editor at such and such press. You should send it to that person. And I know it can seem a little sleazy to be like, oh, it's not what you know, it's who you know, or it's not the talent that's actually just about, people making deals in back rooms. That's not quite the same spirit of people helping other people and being part of a community. So I mean, I would say don't feel afraid to reach out to editors. And if that editor ignores you or is mean, then who cares? Then they're living in pain of some kind. But I think that most editors at journals, especially, which is a labor of love, would be very happy to give what advice they might have, or make suggestions at the very least of a press that would respond to their work.
Yeah, I mean, it is it can feel very cold and opaque, the landscape of poetry publishing. On the other hand, there are these sort of nodes of generosity, and this connectedness that we do all want to ultimately support one another, support art. It isn't, there are no guarantees, even when you do know somebody. I mean, we know this, right? But it doesn't hurt to make relationships with and understand a little bit where you have an audience, right? You have someone who's resonated with your work, and to lean towards that. It's like, it's like trees seeking light. They're going to lean a little bit towards that light.
Yeah. And it's always good to keep in mind that poetry is, and I mean this in the best possible way, it's useless. You're not going to be able, like, you're not going to break the bank, right? Like, the interests are not commercial. Like, so, you're right. If somebody has an article and they're going to get a book deal, they might have a 6-figure book deal for this viral article turned into a book, or novels, you get advances. Even the best poets today, publishing at one of the big 5 publishing houses, they don't get big advances. They do not. They may sell a bunch of books and they may make money on touring. They make, but the point I'm trying to say is, like, poetry retains a little bit of the purity of this literary community, of sharing, of gift giving. So our commerce is the gift. Like, that's how we operate, because none of us is going to break the bank. My chapbook is not going to make a bunch of money. That's not the point. The point was to give the gift of it to readers.
Yeah.
So that's what I like about poetry. I write other genres too, but that makes me feel different about when I'm writing and publishing poetry. So yes, do reach out to people, because people who are into poetry are in the same, it's the same commerce. They're also in the gift giving business.
Yeah. Well, so this feels like a good place to close. Is there anything else that I didn't ask that you wish I had asked?
No, I mean, I think we covered a lot of ground and stuff I hadn't anticipated covering. So that was actually really nice to have a conversation. I will say, if people are interested in purchasing the book, speaking of making money, Rod, they can go to Main Street Rag. It's mainstreetragbookstore.com. And I will say, if they get there early enough, I'm not sure when the sale is going to end, but it's only $7.50. Now that's a really good deal, I think, for
Oh,
a
you can
collection
barely
of
get
poetry.
coffee for that.
I know. I know. But I do want to say, like, speaking of gift giving, that I do really think that Poet to Poet is exactly that. It's a gift.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's absolutely my pleasure.